Bueno, buen día a todos. Tenemos hoy un desayuno muy interesante porque Paulo Burnier de Silveira, que trabaja en la OECD, va a hablar sobre Recent Trends in Latin America, que es un informe que acaba de salir, está todavía caliente todavía el papel, digamos, virtual del informe de la OECD sobre qué está pasando en América Latina. Creemos que vamos a hacer un evento bilingüe en el cual cada uno pueda poder hablar en español si quiere, y Pablo va a hablar va a hacer la presentación en inglés. Así que, Pablo, todo tuyo.
Muchas gracias, Julián. Buenos días a todos en Latinoamérica. Es un gusto muy grande poder ver tantos amigos, colegas, participar de este foro de competencia que ya acompaño a algunos años. Yo voy a hacer la presentación en inglés porque para mí seguramente es más cómodo. Yo creo que para ustedes también será más interesante. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. ¿Puedes solamente confirmar si pueden verlo? ¿Sí?
Sí.
Bueno, yo voy a cambiar el inglés. Hello, everyone. I'll allow myself to speak in English. I'll just try to open the view mode full screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Julián, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. As you know, we have been cooperating in a way for so many years in the region, and it's a fantastic work that you, Julián, have been doing, including through ForoCompetencia and gathering all these people together at least once a month. So thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure. I wanted to share with you, and I think it's also an opportunity to pay tribute to this forum. What I find a very interesting report that the OECD has published 2 weeks ago. So it's indeed very fresh, as Julián has mentioned. It's already available online, but it's available, has been available for only 2 weeks. It was launched in Rio de Janeiro 2 weeks ago during the Latin American competition forum, Latin American and the Caribbean competition forum, which was the 20th edition of this forum, which was quite an interesting moment to launch this report. So what I intend to do, this is the outline of course, the slides will be available afterwards, if in case you need, and I'll be delighted to discuss bilaterally with each one of you if you're interested. But what I had in mind to share with you is, this is a brief outline. Just a couple of words on what is this database of this report that builds competition trends, indicators in the region, and also maybe a word on the OECD work in the region. If we look at the past 20 years, so this work, it's also quite interesting how it evolved during the last 2 decades, and I just wanted to share some numbers. And then we go to the report itself, which is sort of the second big section of the presentation, the competition trends. And the competition trends are divided in 5 chapters: resources, merger control, cartel, abuse of dominance, and market studies. And I'll conclude with very brief final remarks. So this is the plan. I'll start with the good and the bad news to share with you. The bad news is that we have 22 slides, which is a fair amount. But the good news is that all of them, or almost all of them, are composed of graphs. So it will be interesting, so not too much words and text and more graphs and numbers, so that we can discuss together these indicators. And just to highlight an important aspect of the objective of this report before we start, is that the OECD makes an effort to build these indicators to inform policymaking. And I think, once again, this group is a quite privileged group, because they have very senior people, former, either current or former enforcers on competition authorities in the region. So it's quite interesting that these indicators may help us as a community to inform better policies for better lives, as said by the OECD main goal. So, okay, let's start from the beginning, if I may say it this way, the introduction. So what is the database that this report builds on? First, to say that a few years ago, more precise in 2018, the OECD started a work that's called competition stats, competition statistics, or competition trends, that collects data from a set number of jurisdictions around the world, and it then publishes a global report on competition trends. This is how things started. So this Latin American report that was launched 2 weeks ago, actually, its origins date from 2018, because this was the beginning of a more wider project of the OECD. And this wider report, let's call it the global coverage report, includes 73 jurisdictions that represents 73% of the world population and 91% of the world GDP. So, and this report has been launched in 2018, and another edition has been launched in February this year, covering all the numbers that you see in this slide. So 73 jurisdictions, 91% of the GDP, and 73% of the world population. This covers the 38 OECD members. As you may know, the OECD has 38 country members and 35 non-OECD members. So this is the global coverage of, let's put the main report, so the main competition, the OECD competition trends report. In this global report, there is 15 countries or jurisdictions, to be more precise, that concern the Americas. And this is where I link to the Latin American report. So the regional report is a subset of the global report. And it actually covers 14 jurisdictions, to be more precise. The name of the jurisdictions are the ones indicated in this circle. So from alphabetical order, you can see Argentina, Barbados, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Republic Dominicana, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, and the last one is Peru, of course. So 14 jurisdictions is the coverage of the Latin American and the Caribbean OECD competition trends report launched 2 weeks ago. Just to be more precise and explain the difference between one small difference between the previous slide and this one is that these 14 jurisdictions, they exclude US and Canada, and they include Nicaragua, which was a latecomer in the database. So that's why there was 15 in the Americas in the previous slide, and then we exclude US, Canada, 13, and we add Nicaragua because this regional report was actually done throughout this year of 2022, and Nicaragua came a little bit late. So just to explain why there's 14. And these 14 jurisdictions, they represent 85% of the GDP and around also 85% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's interesting to have this in mind, maybe to give not only the coverage, but maybe some credibility to the numbers that will be shared, because they do represent a fair amount of both the population and the GDP in the region. Is everything clear so far? Can we move on? Don't hesitate to ask questions, comments. Let's make this as informal and as interactive as possible in these sort of presentations. So one last word on the OECD region before we jump in the report. In the last 20 years, it's quite impressive the work that the OECD has done in Latin America and the Caribbean. So a couple of slides, this one and the next one, just to show some of them. In the last 20 years, 11 countries have benefited from 33 peer reviews. I'm sure all of you are well aware of this exercise that is called peer review, not only the OECD, but other institutions, international organizations may also develop them. But the OECD has gathered significant knowledge and experience in doing these assessments. And in the last 20 years, the OECD has done it 33 times, benefiting 11 countries in the last 20 years. those are the number of 33 peer reviews are spread out across the region in these 11 countries. A second word on the OECD work before we jump into the report itself is the number. So a metric just to highlight the OECD work in the region is the number of written contributions that the countries from the region have sent to the OECD roundtables and discussions. And we can see, even though the number of jurisdictions remain relatively stable throughout the last 20 years, we can see a sharp increase and a trend, an increasing trend in the number of written contributions made by countries to the OECD discussions. So this already sends a very interesting, or in my view, we're happy to discuss, an interesting message is that more and more the region, when I say the region, I'm referring to Latin America and the Caribbean, they have been more active in the participation, and they have been playing a greater and greater role in the discussions of competition policy globally. And this metrics may serve as an element of this argument. Having said this, I allow myself to jump into the report, which is called OECD Competition Trends in Latin America and the Caribbean. And once again, it's divided in 5 big chapters, and that's how I suggest we can navigate throughout the 5 chapters, starting with resources. So resources, there are two main components of resources. One is budget, and the other one is human resources, so staff. Let's start with budget, and then we go to staff. Here, I think the most interesting thing to notice is the comparison of the average annual budget of competition authorities in Latin America and the Caribbean with the average OECD annual budget of OECD countries. So we can see a clear gap, a clear difference. You can see that the average annual budget of Latin American countries are around 8 million euros per year, roughly between 8 and 10, whereas the OECD average jumps to 24, 25. So roughly speaking, we're talking about 3 times difference. In other words, the annual budget of OECD countries is 3 times greater than the average annual budget of Latin American countries. Data for thought, food for thought. That's one of the purposes of this report. We're happy to discuss pros and cons, but once again, I think one of the idea of the reports just to highlight and also to rephrase and highlight this aspect of my presentation is to provide information, data for a qualified audience as you, so that we can discuss eventually now, tomorrow, in the future, how to evolve and how to improve competition policy in our countries and in the region. Another component of resources is staff. Here we do see a difference between OECD average, green, and the Latin American average, blue, but it's not as strong. So you can see that LAC, just to be clear, is Latin American and Caribbean, okay, the acronym. So average LAC is Latin American and Caribbean. So we can see that the average competition staff in the region is around 100 staff case handlers. Just to be precise, these are competition experts, so people really working on competition enforcement, well, including advocacy, but we're excluding here the administrative staff. So 100 is the average of the staff, whereas the OECD average jumps to 150, 160. So we may say that the OECD average is around 60% higher than the Latin American average in terms of competition staff. Second chapter of the report is mergers. So we have seen resources, now mergers. Now let's start with some good news, because now, until now, we have seen some, let's say, maybe bad news for the region, because we're below the OECD average. I say below because, as you know, I'm a Brazilian national, so I feel included in the region. In terms of merger notification, we can see a quite active merger control enforcement in the region. And these numbers show the total merger notifications per jurisdictions during the time frame covered by the report, which is 2015 to 2020, 6 years, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Each square represents a country. Unfortunately, we were not authorized by the mandate that we received in the OECD, namely the countries themselves, to disclose individual data. So this is why we present the data in this way, because we do not have authorization to disclose which countries represent. But each square of these represents one country. Of course, some of the data covered in the report, including this slide, are often public. So one may identify by indirect ways some of the information, and we can see that at least there is one country that drives these numbers, because it represents almost nearly 50% of all merger notifications of the region, or 40% to be more precise. But one message that I wanted to convey in this slide is that when we cross the regional reports, so Latin American reports, with the other one, the global report, we can notice that around 10% of the total merger notifications around the world concern Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's a lot. That's 10%. So that means that the case law, the developments, merger control in Latin America and the Caribbean represent 10% of what's going on in the world. It seems a significant number to me, but happy to discuss. The type of decisions. This is also an interesting graph that I wanted to share, and it might not so be easy to read, but it goes from 2015 to 2020, so the 6 years that's covered in the report. And it's not, just to be clear, the graph is a correction of the proportion. So please focus on the red circle that indicates the 10% of the cases in 2015 that received some sort of intervention in merger control, namely a prohibition, namely a restriction. And this number has decreased over the years. And now only 5% of the total merger cases in the region receive some sort of intervention, state intervention, namely a prohibition or restriction. So I think this is the main message of this graph. Of course, most cases are approved or cleared without restrictions. This also matches what happens around the world. But maybe one trend to observe and to follow is that in the last 6 years, we have seen a decrease in the number, or the proportion to be more precise, in the percentage of cases in the region, merger control cases, that received some sort of state intervention. And they decreased from 10% to 5%. And this is the message that I wanted to convey in this slide. Happy to discuss the reasons, either now or afterwards. I do have some thoughts, but I'll leave you with the question or the data for future discussion. So let's go to cartel enforcement, and I'll try to remain within my given time. We have seen resources, we have seen merger control. Now let's see maybe a couple or a few slides on cartel enforcement. This slide shows the decrease of leniency applications in the last 6 years in the region. Actually, the average in the region is the blue or green columns, and the yellow line is the OECD average. I don't think it's a secret, or at least many experts have explored. There is a decreasing trend in the number of leniency applications around the world. And the message of this slide, or what the report provides us, is that we can also see this decreasing trend in Latin America. And it roughly matches a little bit the intensity that we notice across the globe. So I think this does not coincide, but it roughly matches the intensity of the decrease. Some reasons may explain. Some people say that it might be related to an increase of private claims of private damages claims before the judiciary. This might be affecting the incentives for leniency, question mark. Other factors may also affect this line. But what I think it's interesting, in addition to the information itself, that there is a decreasing trend of leniency applications in the region, is that it provides some numbers. So, I mean, we're talking about numbers. So it's an evidence-based approach. I mean, we're not just guessing and saying that, okay, we have the feelings, we heard other jurisdictions A, B, and C, they did mention and comment. No, these are numbers. These are numbers that were collected and we are sharing in an aggregated way. So because of the reasons that I've referred to, but they serve to hopefully provide inputs, data, information to better policies. Another information to share is the number of down rates, and I see this slide as a positive aspect for the region. Once again, each little square represents a country or a jurisdiction, to be more precise. As you know, in Latin America, there's two regional competition authorities, but they're not part of the reports. So CARICOM in Caribbeans and the Andean community in South America, they are not part of the reports, but jurisdictions, that's why we often say jurisdictions, because in theory they could be part, and this applies to the wider global reports as well. So each little square represents a jurisdiction. And we can see a more balanced approach. So we can see that the number of down rates are more balanced across a region, and a fair amount if we think in absolute terms. So these are the total number of down rates in the region in the last 6 years, or from 2015 to 2020. The number of cartel decisions. So there's two graphs there. One compares OECD average in blue line with the Latin American average in columns in relation to cartel decisions, and the other one has a similar graph as the previous slide, in the sense that it splits jurisdiction by jurisdiction the number of cartel decisions. It's often the case that two or three jurisdictions, they drive the numbers. This applies to this report in a regional report, but also to the global report. But it's part of the game. I mean, this is an imperfect exercise, but it once again, it hopefully provides useful data and information for us. So the average number of cartel decision, I'll put this slide more in the positive note for the region, because we can see that there is a similar average from the OECD average and the Latin American average in relation to cartel decisions, and not as still some sort of balanced, at least a fair number of jurisdictions that have had cartel decisions in the last years. You can count the number of colors, the number of squares to know the number of jurisdictions. Maybe one last note before we go to abuse of dominance, still on cartel fines, and this may be maybe a negative note, is that the average cartel fines imposed in the region is fairly lower than the average cartel fines of OECD countries. And this graph reflects what I just said. Once again, the blue line represents the average OECD cartel fines, and the blue columns represents the average Latin American cartel fines. Of course, once again, we can speculate the reasons. I'll be happy to throw one of them in order to mitigate maybe a negative note on this, is that often the case, fines are imposed on the annual turnover of these companies, and it would be fair to say that maybe these companies in the region would have lower annual turnovers than in developed countries, or at least compared to the OECD average. So this may explain eventually, but not necessarily means that that is an ineffective fining system, cartel fining system. It can also be explained eventually by other factors, such as that one, the size of the economy, the size of the countries.
Paulo, are these $1 million?
This is million euros, to be more precise.
Euros, okay.
Yeah, thank you for the note. I will add that to the slide. This is $1 million. Abuse of dominance. So we have seen resources, merger control, cartel, abuse of dominance. Oh, just a parenthesis to say that The report does have much more graphs, but I just thought that for the presentation, I did a cherry picking. I chose the ones that I found more interesting to share with you and to hopefully give you the taste to go after the rest of the dish of the meal in the report itself. But the report does provide more graphs and more data. A word on abuse of dominance. This graph represents the number of abuse of dominance decisions, once again comparing average in Latin America with the average of the OECD. And I think we have 2 or 3 slides in relation to abuse of dominance, which the data is quite curious. I'll be keen and curious interested to hear any thoughts that you may have. I do have my own, but it's interesting because here you see a greater average to Latin America, and a fairly greater average to Latin America compared to the OECD average, at least in numbers that were collected and then worked in the report. We can see that the average number in Latin America of decisions of abuse of dominance is roughly around 8 per jurisdiction, whereas in the OECD average is around 3. One reason that may explain, I'll just throw this, once again, happy to discuss, is that there might be an issue of concept here. Because as you may know, or as you may agree, eventually agree, we often consider in Latin America vertical cases inside the category of abuse of dominance. Whereas in Europe and many more than 50% of the OECD countries are European countries, they do make a distinction in the Article 101 and 102 of the European Treaty. And one of them sends the case to agreements and the other one sends to abuse of dominance in the strict sense. Whereas in Latin America, we often include vertical cases, which falls into agreements and from a European perspective into the category of abuse of dominance. So this may explain this difference. Second slide, which has a dialogue with the previous one, is the number of settlements and commitments. And here, in a way, is the opposite. We can see that almost 50% in average of the OECD cases are terminated. Abuse of dominance cases are terminated by settlements or commitments, 40% to be more precise. Whereas in Latin America and the Caribbean, this number is fairly reduced to maybe 10, 15%, to around 10%. So the percentage of cases that are settled in abuse of dominance is much lower in Latin America than the OECD. Maybe 2 thoughts on this. One matches the one that I mentioned before, a matter of concept and what is being considered abuse of dominance for these purposes. And the second one is maybe the quality of the cases, because these are decisions. So the file decisions are included in these numbers. So it could be the case that maybe in Latin America, many weak cases are opened and then they're closed. And they are added to the database because they are considered abuse of dominance decision cases, but they were filed, and therefore they were not subject to settlements or commitments. Maybe, and going back to going to the end of the report, finishing with advocacy, and actually the advocacy in the report is limited to market studies because this was the metrics that the OECD found most appropriate to try to measure an advocacy action or initiative. So through the number of market studies. And this, I would say, it's also a positive note to the region, because the Latin American countries, they are in average producing the same number in average of market studies that we see in the OECD average. So the first graph on the left indicates that the average of the OECD and the average number of market studies in the region, and the other graph is the dispersion. So the number of countries in the region that have been producing market studies and the absolute numbers in the last 6 years. Well, not the last 6 years, but from 2015 to 2020. So we can also see sort of a balanced approach. We can see a fair number of jurisdictions Once again, there's only 14 jurisdictions participating in the report, so we can count the number of squares. We can see that the majority of the jurisdictions participating in the report, they have an active policy of market studies. This is the message that these slides convey. With this, I finish the report, and I just have a couple of final remarks before I finish my presentation and maybe engage in a discussion. Julian, if you wish, my thoughts, my takes on everything that has been said. Of course, my highlight takes is that one, the last 20 years, it's impressive how the presence of the OECD has increased in the region. Some numbers. The OECD has today four countries who are members of the OECD. Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica. We can see the evolution. Mexico is from 94. Chile is from 2010 that has joined the OECD. Colombia 2020 and Costa Rica 2021. And we have three countries in the accession process: Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. Hundreds of written contributions have been submitted by the Latin American countries and the Caribbean countries to the OECD discussions. And with this, I wanted to say that I have the feeling that there is a clear shift in the region from simply being a collector or a beneficiary of the OECD work, and maybe in the last 10 years, starting really to be a provider of inputs and participating in the shape and the reshaping of competition policy around the world. I really don't think, from my view, that it would be an exaggeration to say it this way, but it's a clear shift that Latin American countries have experienced in the last 20 years, and it reflects the prioritization and the efforts that many governments in the region have put in competition policy, and more precisely in competition authorities, in the last years. On the report itself, just to summarize, we left, or at least I speak here in my personal capacity, because these are a little bit of my assessment. My takes on the reports, and if we divide in the 5 big chapters of the report, we can see an active merger, an active presence and merger control enforcement of the region, globally speaking. The region represents roughly 20% of the merger control regimes around the world, and it represents 10% of the total merger notifications across the globe. The cartel enforcement is in average, within the OECD average, maybe with an exception to the sanctions that are lower. Abuse of dominance, I think the developments should be carefully monitored to properly interpret and consider and understand the data that is provided in the report, maybe with the particularities of the region. Market studies are also within the OECD average. At least this is what the report, what emerged from the report. And last but not least, we can see a clear, I wouldn't say a trend, but in terms of resources, both budget and staff, we can see that the region is fairly below the OECD average. So with this, I finished, Julian. I just present the covers of the reports. The one in the left is the main global report, the OECD competition trends, that was launched in February. The one in the middle is a regional report launched last year. So in a similar way that we did for Latin America this year, our colleagues from Asia Pacific did it for their region last year. And last, the cover in our right is the cover of our regional report that concerns Latin America and the Caribbean. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. Sorry if I took a little bit longer than we had agreed, and I remain available to discuss and exchange any ideas that you may have. Thank you, Julian.
Muchas gracias, Paulo. Realmente nos has dado bastante material para analizar. Antes de darle la palabra a Diego, quisiera, digamos, tú te sacaste el sombrero para hacer tus conclusiones, pero no te sacaste, pero tus conclusiones fueron respecto a Latinoamérica vis-a-vis OECD countries. Digamos, la pregunta es ¿cuáles son tus conclusiones del informe si tuviese que describir la situación en América Latina? Digamos, ¿cuáles son los trends que ves en general y en particular en las 5 áreas que has presentado?
So yes, thank you very much, Julia, for the question. I'll allow myself to react in English.
Sure, that's the idea.
It's a bit easier. So I think that the trends are similar. So it matches the global report in terms of trends. So the main trends of what's going up and what's going down. Maybe one exception is the abuse of dominance, but once again, this is an area that I think it deserves to be better explored, considering the particularities of the region and how we read in the region abuse of dominance cases. But for instance, to be more precise, the decrease in the leniency applications, I think this is one of the most strongest sign that both the global report and the regional report, they highlight and they put numbers to it. So it's not only a guess or a feeling, it's really an empirical work of evidence-based approach. Resources is something very interesting to monitor. So maybe the economists can add or complement what I'll be saying, but I don't see a clear trend in when we watch the last 6 years in the resources. And that's maybe it's a little difference between, and to answer more precisely your question, a little difference between the European the global findings and the regional findings, because in the global findings you do see a slight trend increase, whereas in the region you don't. So this may send a message that the average, both resources, both staff and budget, you do not see an increasing trend. You do not see a decreasing trend, at least, but they seem quite stable, both staff and budget. This sends a message. It sends a message that it's stable. Is this good? Is this bad? I don't know. As a competition expert or as a competition enthusiast, I would rather to see it increasing. But it might reflect the priorities of the region in a way.
Diego.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. As you said, in OECD countries, they have 60% more of human resources than Latin American countries, and the budget is 3 times the one of each other. So I think that we can suppose that human resources in OECD countries are well paid or better paid than in Latin American countries. But when we analyze the cases, you say that are in the average in number of cases and decisions. So can we say that the human resources in Latin American countries are more efficient because with less resources decide the same case, the same cases or the same quantity of cases?
Hello. Yeah, that's a good note. I think it would be a bit premature to say it this way, and the reason is the following. Well, first is it's true that the average number of staff is 60% higher, but we would have to see if this matches the proportion of cases, because for instance, in merger control, although the region represents 10% of the total merger notifications, I'm not sure how this would match this argument of the efficient. I would love to agree with you as a Latin American, but I'm not sure that we have enough data to affirm this argument, unless we do an exercise of comparing with the global report and seeing, yeah, a more complete view of the total number of enforcement cases. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say because, I mean, these are numbers. I mean, the reports are useful, but you know that a case can take 20 days and it can take 10 months. A market study can have 20 pages or 200 pages. So in order to properly have this statement, I think that other metrics would have to be added. I would love to agree with you and say that Latin Americans are more efficient than the OECD average, but I would not risk of saying so.
Very diplomatic. Mariana.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Paulo, for this great presentation. I found it extremely interesting. I think it's it's probably the first assessment with real numbers. I think it matches what we've all sensed, but I think it's the first time, at least it's for me, it's the first study with real numbers on very specific areas. Thank you for that, and thank you for your input. Just because we have the luxury of having you and because I have the mic open, I have two questions. One specifically regarding the report. I think it seems like a very, in general, a positive overview of the evolution of competition policy in the region over the past 6 years, and certainly the contribution from the OECD plays a critical role. We know how useful, how important the resources, the technical assistance programs by the OECD influence with that respect. My question on that point is whether even though the general overview is positive, whether you notice any area where you have any particular concern, where things are not going so well, maybe, and this is in a way related to the first question that you answered. And the second question is on slightly unrelated area, is whether you see a role for Latin American and Caribbean agencies in the new competition themes, sustainability, arbitration, and maybe tax and competition, the interface between antitrust and the areas, and whether competition agencies in the region should be looking at these issues, or just or waiting and see on how more mature agencies are dealing with these issues. Again, congratulations, great presentation.
Thanks a lot, Mariana, for your kind words. It's lovely to see you. Well, to react to your questions, Mariana, I agree with you that I think that the reports has this tone of a positive evolution in the region. Maybe to be more precise, more critical, maybe in the report or the findings, as you have asked. I think resources is something that really strikes from the report, and it hopefully will become a piece of an advocacy for governments to advocate for better resources, both budget and staff. So this really emerges as it strikes as a difference. And maybe one less clear, because this is a clear note, the one on resources, but one less clear note, and this is really, I'm speaking on top of my head, I was quite intrigued with the merger slide when we see the percentage of cases in merger control that receive some sort of state intervention. So in 2015, there were around 10% of the cases, they were either blocked or received some sort of conditions and clearance. Whereas in 5 years afterwards, and you can see it's a trend, it's half, it's 5%. This tells me something, and I don't think it's by chance. I think it tells me something. It tells us something. So only 5% of the merger cases have been subject to some sort of state intervention. I'm not suggesting that the competition authorities should do more. I'm not suggesting this. I'm just suggesting that maybe it might be an issue with the thresholds. Maybe the thresholds are floating, and you know that we have inflation in the region, at least higher inflation, especially in certain countries, very high inflation. This may affect if the thresholds are not corrected year by year. So for the countries that have an annual turnover threshold, when this threshold is not corrected, this means that when you see the film, the movie, the last 5 years, transactions that would not have been notified 5 years ago are being notified. And they might not raise competition concerns. So I'm not suggesting that the competition authority should intervene more often. It's not what I'm suggesting. But I am suggesting that I think there might be factors that explain why 5 years ago, when I say 5 years ago, I'm referring to 2015, 10% of the merger cases in the region were either blocked or received clearance with remedies, and now only 5% of them reacted. Because this competition authorities may be invited to explain to the public opinion or to the governments the spending of these resources. I mean, right? This is often an argument that is heard not only in the region but across the globe. I mean, you competition authority, you analyze 200 merger cases per year, and you only see problem in 2 of them. Why do we need to pay you for the other 198 cases? Of course, we're from the sector. We're from competition experts, so we know the reasons. But it's not as easy as it seemed to explain to a government official or to the one providing budget or even to the public opinion. So finding the right match in merger control, I think it's something that at least intrigued me to be very open and transparent on this regard. On your question on the goals of competition more broadly, well, 2 notes. First note that this is not covered in the report. So the report is really about data and trends. So you really, from the report, it's not possible to bring additional elements to this question. But of course, from my work in the OECD, and this is the second note that I wanted to share, of course, this is a topic that has been quite present in our desktop, in our routine, as you and many of you may have been following in the last years, the discussions, the roundtables, and it's not different in the region. So I do see these sort of non-traditional or the discussion on the goals of competition present in the region as well. And I have a feeling, but again, I'm speaking the top of my head, that some countries may be more inclined to accept or to more easily accept this discussion as long as it fits the little framework of competition analysis. So if you bring an environmental case and you add this as an efficiency or as an equality element, because this merger will provide better, innovation towards greener energy or cleaner energy. So this is a way of internalizing the discussion, the sustainability discussion within the little traditional framework of competition analysis. So on this side, I can see a sort of a better acceptance of countries, broadly speaking. But of course, the discussion is much broader than that, as we see not only in Latin American region, but elsewhere.
Esteban.
Thank you.
Gracias. Primero una clarificación. Cuando hablas de decisions, o el informe habla de decisions in abuse of dominant cases and cartel cases, ¿eso incluye casos con sanciones y settlements, o incluye también casos desestimados sin ningún tipo de sanción?
It includes both, Esteban, and it's a very fair question. So when the OECD asks the countries in the number of decisions, it includes all the cases that went to an end. So either a sanction, or they were filed, or they were settled. So the number of settlements is included in the total decision cases. It's a very fair question, because it's an important one to have a proper understanding of what the numbers try to tell us.
Gracias. No, bueno, felicitaciones, porque es un trabajo muy, muy bueno y muy útil. Y creo que, como dijo Mariana, ¿no? Es un primera gran trabajo de cuantificación. Hay un trabajo del Banco Mundial bueno también que se ha hecho, que se presentó acá en el foro también sobre carteles, pero este es más amplio y que creo que es muy útil incluso para practitioners y los policymakers. Y quería preguntarte, no sé si la información o tu visión del reporte lo permite, digamos, si hay alguna relación o alguna posibilidad de vínculo entre estas estadísticas y la configuración institucional o el diseño institucional. El hecho de que haya agencias con mayor o menor independencia, o incluso con el diseño de separación de las funciones de adjudicación y de investigación. Si algún tipo de institutional settings o design está contemplado, o si encontrás alguna relación entre performance en términos de indicadores y diseño institucional.
So the short answer is unfortunately no. The report does not go that far. I think it's a practical issue because the scope of the report would require more and more resources to gather the data, to analyze the data. So it was choices that were made in terms of scope of the report. To be precise, there's some elements that you may find in the report, but they do not consider independence or autonomy. They consider sort of institutional setup in the strict sense. For instance, the merger control, it does cover and indicate the number of countries that have a one-phase system or a two-phases system. The number of countries, the average, both in Latin America for the regional report and more broadly in the global report, the number of countries, the jurisdictions that have pre-merger control or post-merger control, or a mix of those. So these things you do find in the report. If it's a one-phase merger control system, if it's a two-phase merger control system, what's the kind of merger notification criteria? So the thresholds are they market share? Are they annual turnover? Are they transaction value? These numbers you do find in the report. So the number of jurisdictions that use transaction value as a criteria for notification of mergers. In Latin America, for instance, there are two countries. There are two jurisdictions that have this criteria. The report does not state which ones of them, but it's a public information. So it's but just for consistency purposes, the report did not disclose. But this is an example that it is a public information. There's two countries that do have, it's not a single criteria, but so all this to say that there are some elements of institutional setup more broadly, but not the ones related to autonomy nor performance vis-a-vis independence of these authorities.
Vicente.
Thank you. Thanks. First of all, thanks, Paulo, for the very interesting presentation. As you say, me as an economist, I found the resources part very interesting. And I had two questions regarding this. I was wondering whether the figures can be a bit, you can open the figures in the sense, for instance, of looking the number of staff in merger control or the number of staff in anti-cartel enforcement, because this would, for instance, allow you to build measures of efficiency. For instance, you can look at the number of notifications or leniency applications per number of staff. And this, for instance, could give you a sense of whether your competition authority is overfunded or underfunded in a given department. And then you could, given you have limited resources, it could help you to reallocate resources, for instance, if you compare with the average of Latin American or with the average of an OECD country. So this was one question, whether it was possible to have figures like this, like number of staff per type of department. And then the second question was whether you could build some indicator of the staff in terms of whether they have PhD or whether they have master studies of things like this, because as somebody said, it seems like the OECD staff is better paid. But I mean, it's not necessarily the case. It might be that you have fewer resources in Latin America, and then you don't have the possibility to hire, for instance, PhD the PhD people or people with more qualifications. So I was wondering whether it was possible to build, or whether you have considered building these kind of features, because I think it would be very, very interesting and useful information.
Yeah, no, thanks, Cynthia. It's a great question. I'll start from the end to say that maybe one note or clarification. For purpose of the report, everything was converted into euros so that we can have a comparable figure. And the numbers, all the currencies that are not in euro, they were converted in 31st of December 2015. That was to mitigate a little bit the fluctuations during the 6 years of the conversion rates, but also to have a more, comparable figures. But I agree with you, starting from the end, is that the report does not allow us to say about remuneration of staff because costs are different. So I mean, it's of course resources are in absolute terms are higher in the OECD average, but the costs may be the cost of living, etc. should be probably are an average higher than in the region. So it's hard to have the perfect match. On your first comment and question, Cynthia, I think I personally think it would be great, and we did think about doing this, dividing more precisely to rephrase and to recollect your question. Okay, let's divide the staff on areas, right? Okay, this jurisdiction has 100 people working on competition, but where? Cartels, abuse, mergers, etc. But it was very hard to build this way because many countries many jurisdictions will have a really hard time to reply in this way. Some of them, they mix them, they have 10 people or 20 people working on all cases, and they don't have a clear allocation. I have seen, not in the OECD report, but I have seen other researchers that try to do that, and sometimes they answer 1.5 staff, because there is one staff and a half that works in mergers, because one person is working in mergers and abuse. So you risk having these sort of replies. So once again, I think it's possible, difficult but possible. This round of the report did not consider this sort of sub-classification of the data. Of course, this is an ongoing process, ongoing exercise. So maybe next year and 2 years from now, we're gonna release with maybe a slightly wider scope. For instance, one element that we're really trying to consider for next year is public procurement. Public procurement is, or even economic sectors more broadly, and maybe including this aspect, which is not an economic sector, but a dimension of public procurement, which may be very, very interesting for public policies to understand, how much of the resources are being employed in cartel cases related to public procurement and things like that. So just to react to your question by saying that, for instance, public procurement has not yet been included, but it will hopefully be included in the near future. And the message that I wanted to convey is that all these questions and comments such as yours, it's very helpful for us because it does provide some feelings and suggestions of how to improve in a realistic way. Again, and picking on reaction that I to Mariana or to Esteban, I don't recall, but there's also a matter of practicability, feasibility, right? Of the number of people working on this. So we need to be realistic in the sense of what can be done with the limited resources, limited team to do that. And just to be clear, there's a team behind this. I was very happy to integrate the team that developed the Latin American report, but there is a CompStat, a competition statistic team dedicated to this work.
Alfonso.
Yes, thank you very much. Paulo, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. My question is regarding the leniency program, and you mentioned that the the trends in Latin America are similar to those in the rest of the OECD countries, meaning that there is a sensitive decline in the leniency applications. And you mentioned that, but I don't know if this is a hard conclusion from the study, that is possibly because of the increase in the damages actions. In fact, in Europe, they created the directive for the damages directive in 2014, and we have seen the application of the directive and the increase in the action related to damages in Europe. In Latin America, we have some of the countries have similar measures or have been implementing them recently, but we don't see the damages action. There are some, but not many. And in the studies that we have conducted in several of the Latin American countries, there is no real fear of the damages actions yet. So I wonder the coincidence in the decline of the, and we have the decline, of course, as you mentioned, in the leniency application. So I wonder if there are other factors, like for instance, the application of criminal statutes that are not covered by the leniency. The leniency benefits don't cover benefits related or immunity related to the criminal actions in many of the countries. In Chile they do, in Mexico they do, but there are other countries where the criminal application of the competition statute creates a disincentive for the leniency applications. And you also mentioned that the fines seem to be appropriate for the size of the economy. So there is the incentive that there are big fines for the Latin American companies to enter into cartel conduct, but still we have the decline in the leniency application. So could you expand a little bit on what is your sense? What do you feel about this decrease in the leniency applications for the case of Latin America, taking into account that these incentives and disincentives seem not to be exactly the same as in other countries of OECD?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alfonso. I mean, I start by agreeing with everything you said. I think that one of the striking indicators of the report is that one, because it puts in numbers a general feeling that has been across the world and including the region of the decline of leniency. I think it's a matter of incentives. So it's what is interesting is that in these 6 years, from 2015 to 2020, the decline appears in this period. So I would say that in this period, there are factors that are affecting the incentives. Which one is really a question mark? It's what we did in the report. We tried to remain prudent in a way, because the objective of the report was to provide data and indicators precisely to be discussed. So once again, I'm speaking here in my totally personal capacity. I think you touched on very important points in terms of the factors that may influence on this, Alfonso. For instance, criminal that you mentioned. I understand that certain countries at least one, but certain countries in the region, they did face changes in this period of 6 years that are affecting leniency in their countries. Specifically because criminal individuals are not covered in the criminal front. So this may be affecting the incentives for companies, which are managed by individuals, to apply for leniency, because having more legal certainty and more previsibility in terms of protection in both administrative and criminal fronts, it's an important ingredient for the package of incentives. So I agree with you in the sense that I mean, not only this, but when you mentioned that the private actions in Europe, this is sort of the clear speculation in Europe because of the directive that you mentioned and the increase of numbers of private claims. If it's the case of Latin America, question mark. I don't know. Brazil has been seeing an increase of actions in the front of civil actions, and it has been pushed by legal reforms. So is this affecting the leniency? I don't know, question mark, but it is a movement. I mean, it is if we look at the last 5-6 years, it is a change.
I understand that in Brazil, the decline in the leniency applications is not that big. We had recently the president of CADE here in Bogota, and he said that they are having very good leniency applications in Brazil. So, and you say that the damages actions in Brazil are increasing, which is not the case in the other countries. In the other countries, there has been no development of the damages actions yet. Probably there are the legal tools and everything, but not yet is a trend. And I understand. You say that in Brazil it is. So.
Yeah, I hear. I hear, and I like the discussion, because I think the discussion, the way I see it, is that let's map the possible factors. So for sure, civil claims are not the only factor on the table that may explain. There is also the criminal interface with the administrative sanctions. There's also the level of fining. If I understand correctly, maybe it's a possible explanation that you raise. Well, maybe the fines are not enough, and it's not deterring companies, and therefore incentivizing them to come up. So we have civil claims, you have criminal interface, you have fining policy, mapping the factors. I think it's a great start to properly understand. To properly understand, and then try to address the best way possible because of the impact that this may have in cartel enforcement. So I think this is the exercise. I mean, at least at this moment, is less providing the answers and at least understanding better the scope of the questions and the issues, and then trying to address. Of course, and again, just to maybe to rephrase something that I tried to indicate during the presentation, these reports, they need to be read carefully, because they provide data. You know, you mix them, you put them in a mixer, and then you throw them back in average numbers. Of course, countries are different. I mean, if you take the examples, specific examples that we notice, so Brazil have seen a big increase during the Lava Jato case, and then leniency, as I understand, remained high but lower than 3 years ago. I mean, it's so if you see, try to see a curve, but it does reflect the decrease, although in significant numbers still.
Yes, and let me add something to the map. And it's a regional concern, and is the Andean community is the Secretary General of the Andean community is a competition authority. Decision 608 of the Andean community, which is the antitrust statute, doesn't have a leniency program. And in the past few years, the SGCAN has addressed some cases, especially the soft paper case, in which there had already been cases in the national countries, in the member countries, in Colombia and in Peru, and even like that, they made a soft paper case, and these soft paper cases in the national authorities, they had a leniency program. So there's an non-bis in idem problem there, and probably to add to the disincentives, if you apply for leniency in a country and then the Andean community without a leniency program starts an investigation that is identical to the one that you already defended, then there is a disincentive for leniency.
You're totally right. I totally see your point.
Ivo.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Paulo.
Hi, Ivo.
Nice to see you. Thank you for sharing your outcomes of the report. Just one question. Are you going to share this report also with the authorities? And I mean, not only the competition agencies, but especially the policymakers as a congressman, because I think you should do it in order to have some kind of amendments in our legislation.
Right. No, it's a great question, Ivo, and it's lovely to see you too. The purpose of the report is to be as wider spread as possible. So we do sort of reach out not only to this audience, specialized audience, but also to the competition authorities in order to encourage them to circulate the report around their houses and their countries, because I totally agree with you. It's part of the essence of the report itself. It becomes an advocacy instrument for countries to advocate for more resources or changes that may affect the incentives of leniency programs, as Alfonso has just mentioned, and so forth. So it's a clear yes to this question. You're completely right.
Excellent. Thanks.
I have one more question. Is the report says that, and perhaps this is contrary to what Diego said before, that the human resources are the budget is similar to what it was 6 years ago, but there's less leniency activity, less cartel fines, there are less dominant cases, there are less merger control enforcement or equality wise. So there is more merger cases, but not necessarily more merger control activity. But do you think that there is a reason behind this decline in the activity in the past 6 years in general, or this is just a coincidence that for instance, leniency was going down on one way, and there is less merger control activity on the other, or do you see broader reasons for this decline?
I don't necessarily agree with the premise of your question, because if I understand correctly, you're saying that with the same amount of people, competition authorities are doing less work.
No, there's less effective competition enforcement. There's less sanctions, less leniency cases. There's less. The merger cases are more flexible or less enforcement so in a way there's a decline in except on the budget. There's a decline on the other indicators that you have pointed out.
No, I understand the question, but once again, I'm not necessarily agree, because the presentation just gathers some information on the report. So I have the report here in my hands.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to see other elements, for instance, the number of ex officio investigations. So, which is not in my presentation, but it does, it's an element of your question. So is it increasing or decreasing? For instance, the number of market studies, which it is in my presentation, because the feeling that I have is that it's just a matter of reallocation of work. So I agree with you in the sense that, and this is maybe something interesting to be explored, how throughout the 6 years of data, the work have been reallocated within competition authorities. In other words, is cartel enforcement less prominent in proportionally vis-a-vis other areas, including advocacy? How and how much is this rebalancing taking place? So I would rather frame, or at least I would rather read the question this way, and not in a way that competition authorities may be. I wouldn't presume that they're delivering more or less with the same resources. I'd rather presume that they're delivering the same, the same amount, but maybe in different formats and in different ways.
Okay. Is there no more?
There's just a question in the chat box, but I haven't read it. Do you think the emphasis that the OECD gives to cartel prosecution may be biased? Maybe biased in enforcement? I'm not sure if the person is still online, if he or she wants to expand on that. But
No.
to answer quickly, I don't see a bias in the way that at least the way the question was framed.
Okay, great. Your concluding remarks?
No, just wanted to thank you, Julian, and thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate not only the invitation, but the opportunity to have a discussion in a frank, a transparent, and especially high-level way with this audience that is very qualified and with whom I have worked for a number of years now, and with whom and through whom I have learned so much. So thank you very much for the opportunity to exchange with you, Julian, and for everyone.
Well, thank you for taking your time, and congratulations once again for the report, which is very useful, and for bringing the debate here to ForoCompetencia. So we are the ones who are thankful to you, and to the rest. Well, next month we have our breakfast will be with Jason Silveira. He will be talking about competition and regulation in Latin America. So
thank you very much.
That will be in November. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Gracias, buen día. Gracias.
Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.